Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I am the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. Coming to you here on my YouTube channel with the Stormwall Advisors monthly update for October 2024. As always, if you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to give it a like, a share, a subscribe, turn on the notification bell. Check out my channel here on YouTube to see all my videos, and go to stormwall.com. Sign up for weekly emails where you'll get something every week on critical topics that I'm writing about, thinking about, and acting on. It's been a busy and crazy few weeks. I mean, look back at what's happened over the past month. We had a second assassination attempt on President Trump, which is news in itself. We could take the whole time to talk about that, what that could mean, what it might mean. We'll come back to that at the end. We saw a lot of macroeconomic and monetary policy activity. We saw the Fed lower its interest rates. We saw markets vault to all-time highs or continue at all-time highs, despite weakening in the environment. We've got lots of conflicting data about whether the labor markets are overheated, cooling off. Layoffs are at their highest level since 2020, but other indications are that the labor market is strong. At the same time, we know other central banks around the world are beginning to lower rates in a global easing cycle. We'll come back and talk about all of that. We saw the East Coast port workers strike come and go after Biden capitulated. We'll talk about that. And here we are in the middle of hurricane season. Helene, massive flooding, property destruction, looting having just passed. And as I record today, Hurricane Milton, now Category 5, on its way towards the coast of Florida. So let's get into this. And by the way, none of that included what's happening in the Middle East, with Israel and Iran ratcheting up the escalation ladder very quickly. Iran taking out Hezbollah leaders in Beirut and moving in bombings in Beirut, and moving into Lebanon, and Iran retaliating with another set of attacks. So let's talk first about the monetary policy. Is the world moving into a new cycle of global easing? It looks to be the case. So we saw here in the U.S. that the Federal Reserve announced a cut in its target interest rates by 50 basis points, 0.5%. Target rates now 4.75 to 5%. Now, the markets had largely anticipated this. It was priced in. Stocks reacted favorably, but it was largely anticipated. Nothing, no big surprise there. It was the first cut since 2020, since the COVID pandemic and lockdowns associated with it, and all the fiscal and monetary stimulus that came about as a result. And it was relatively large. So the last two times that there was a 50 basis point cut in one day was 2007, on the eve of the global financial crisis, and all the way back to 2000 or 2001, when we were in the middle of the dot-com bubble at that time. So Fed thinks something serious is going on, and they needed to pull out all the stops to try to address it. The concern that we'll come back to is this the spark that will light a return of an inflationary cycle. Now, at the same time, China unleashes its own monetary bazooka, with the People's Bank of China easing financial conditions to stave off a potential economic crisis. I wrote about this in an article called "The Chinese Regime Panics Over the Economy." Couple key points. The PBOC reduced the cost of borrowing from the central bank. So that's banks who are borrowing from the central bank, going to cost them less. They injected tens of billions of dollars of liquidity into the financial system to ease up what was becoming a very tight and unpleasant monetary situation, liquidity situation, or illiquidity. They lowered the regulatory reserves that banks are required to hold. In other words, the amount of capital that they have to hold against risk assets such as loans, securities, and other things, making it easier for them to continue to operate, and for the weaker banks to survive a bit longer. For the consumer, they lowered the rates on existing mortgages and reduced the down payment requirement on a second home from 25 to 15%. And they have, for the first time ever, started to intervene directly into the equities market when they announced a facility to allow securities houses, brokers, dealers, investment funds, et cetera, to access the central bank's liquidity. So this is a very strange, almost panic signal, and really a warning to the global economy that things are not going well. Now, the markets, in classic or typical response these days, where they find good news is good news and bad news is good news, and even better, Chinese markets were up as a result of this news. Now, we've seen this easing cycle happening around the world. We've talked about the US already. The UK, the Bank of England, has seen a 25% basis point reduction to 5%. ECB is coming out later this month or next week, I believe, likely to see a reduction there. China, we talked about a 20 basis point reduction to 1.5%. Japan, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how they raised their rates by a mere 25 basis points and nearly sent the global markets tumbling as people were afraid that the yen carry trade was going to completely unwind. Now, what's interesting about this is the Fed is responding to a situation where financial conditions for banks and for financial firms are actually at their easiest since the COVID stimulus in 2020, 2021. So here at the end of September of this year, the net financial conditions index shows a negative 0.55. That's very accommodative. So above the 0.0 line here means that conditions are restrictive. When it falls down below, they are quite accommodative. And this is indicating that the financial conditions here, at least in the US, are easing and that the Fed is lending more money into those easy conditions. Now, it's interesting to note that at the same time, it's not that anywhere around the world there's a tight amount of capital or liquidity available. In fact, the world is awash in liquidity. Look at the world's major central banks, M2 money supply, up 300%, three times since the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. It's up by a third since pre-COVID-19 periods. And when you print this much money, when the money supply goes up by this much, it is inevitable that price inflation, will eventually keep up with that growth in the aggregates. It's inevitable. It's delayed. It can be delayed by a number of years, as we've seen in the US, but eventually inflation catches up with the money supply. Now, at the same time, last week, the U.S. market was threatened with the potential for East Coast port workers going on strike, affecting the entire economy with an estimated 4.5 to 7.5 billion in damage to the U.S. economy every week that they were out of work. So for context, we were talking about 50,000 workers, roughly 14 striking ports across the U.S. See a map of them here, across all the way down from New England down to Texas, and really 100,000 workers impacted, not just those who are part of the union, but also anybody in support roles around the industry of import and export and ports. This was the first major port strike since 1977, and there was a lot of concern about the supply chain disruption and that this itself would be a potential inflationary spark. Now, what had the unions asked for? They had asked for a 77% increase in wages, not all at once, over 6 years. But they had also asked specifically for a limit on future automation of the port. So the Longshoremen Union, concerned about jobs being replaced by technology, by capital, by AI, by whatever has it, and they wanted to have contractual assurance that none of that would take place. Now, this whole strike was putting enormous pressure on the Biden-Harris administration to address it, to mediate. Biden had powers under the Taft-Hawley Act to restrict the strikers, or at least send it through a particular process of arbitration. So it wasn't just run amok. They would be required to stay on the job for 80 days while arbitrators worked themselves out. Biden refused to act in this way, but he did intervene in a manner of speaking. And so within about 2 to 3 days of strike, the International Longshoremen Association and the U.S. Maritime Alliance, which controls and runs the ports, reached a tentative deal on wages. Nothing on automation, nothing on the future of whether U.S. markets will remain globally competitive by having the most up-to-date processes in place, or whether we will revert back to the 20th century in terms of use of labor versus capital in those ports. You could argue, I suppose, that in an era of global uncertainty and geopolitical risk, including the risk of highly automated environments to disruption, perhaps there is a balance here that needs to be struck. But what's interesting is the compromise accommodated a 63% average compensation increase for the highest paid of the workers over 6 years. That moves their hourly wage up from $39 to $63 an hour, sort of somewhere in the middle of where the bid ask was between the port operator and the union. There's been a lot of discussion over this as to whether this wasn't a form of extortion over the American economy, just given the links that the ports have with the consumer economy, given that this is right in the middle of holiday season or the preparation for holiday season among the retailers and otherwise. And it struck me that something else as well. I was reminded of how in Germany and the Weimar Republic and in other hyperinflations, unionized workers actually do well. They come out okay. The very rich do well. Speculators, people who can see the markets, what is happening, people who are closest to the money printer, the banks, the financiers, and something called the Cantillon effect. The people closest to the printing presses do the best. The people furthest away do the worst. But unionized labor actually did okay. It was the middle class that was completely decimated and that are decimated in hyperinflations. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, people who don't have the sort of unionized labor representation. Now, some teachers do. That's maybe not the best example, but professional classes, certainly managerial classes, certainly are the ones who historically have been most impacted by inflations. Now, it's interesting to contrast Biden's response with President Reagan in 1981 when the air traffic controllers went on strike. Now, antecedent to this was President Jimmy Carter had taken a lot of action to strengthen federal employees' protections. This led to the passage of the Federal Labor Relations Act in 1978. This was also at a time when inflation was raging. Workers were being squeezed on all sides. President Reagan, newly elected President Reagan, and Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker were working very hard to contain it when the air traffic controllers, federal workers, all of them went on strike. Now, Taft-Hartley, the rule that Biden could have invoked to end or at least pause the strike of the longshoremen, did not apply here because it only applied to private sector. President Reagan himself, in a former life, had been a member of the union, had led a strike himself, was a member, I think, in the leadership of the AFL-CIO, so wasn't hostile per se to unions, but he was hostile to the idea of the U.S. government being shut down, of our air traffic security being impacted. One could ask the question, are our ports in that same category classification of critical infrastructure that ought to be protected and that ought to have some assurances that we're not going to see the kind of disruption that was potentially possible? I'm all for the longshoremen making a decent wage. Absolutely. I am concerned about the way this happened and whether it wasn't somewhat extortionary over the entire economy. So Reagan, in contrast to Biden, ended up after 2 days of these air traffic controllers going on strike, firing them all. Over 11,500 plus air traffic controllers, all in a single day, and basically declared a lifetime ban of the rehiring of those strikers by the Federal Aviation Administration. So very strong, very heavy hand, heavily criticized at the time, but it did set a tone, and it for a new era of labor relations, created a bit of a balance. One of the things that had happened in the early 70s that had turned many Americans away from the unions was, just like we saw in this small example of the port strike, is in the 1970s during high inflation, many unions did use that power, their power, to shut down the economy and really fueled inflation. And so there is a balancing act. Listen, I have family members, uncles, and otherwise who were very dedicated union men their whole life, but even they were not pleased with some of the things they saw going on in this era in the 70s and the 80s. Let's move on. So the whole question of lowering interest rates comes down to the question of just how strong is the labor market. So we just got new data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics showing that non-farm payrolls grew by 250,000 jobs in September. This was a lot higher than 150,000, and the unemployment rate ticked down. Now, below the hood, and we should always look below the hood, a lot of those jobs came from government workers. Nonetheless, the market loved it. Stocks rose again to record highs. Oil was up 9% on the week. The Fed may be making a big mistake in lowering rates if the job market is as strong as this shows. However, these data continue to be disconnected from the private sector data. So Challenger, another private sector survey found that US-based employers had announced 73,000 job cuts in September. That was up 53% from the same month a year ago. And that year to date, there have been 609,000 layoffs. And the way to compare that would be against 2 million in 2020, where the layoffs were truly massive. A lot of this was in technology. We've talked about it before, that entertainment and technology have been some of the hardest hit. Other sectors, education, transportation, and manufacturing, each losing around 25,000 jobs. It's important when we talk about that Bureau of Labor Statistics information, that data, to go back to last month where we talked about the fake government statistics, where the BLS estimates, they came out and admitted that they had overstated jobs by 819 private sector, 819,000 private sector jobs through March of 2024. And they had to revise all of the data, and they blamed this on a technical error, of course. So when we say technical error, and whenever we talk about government models, you should know that these statistical models are models, purely that. These are mechanical devices created on a computer somewhere, where models are created, inputs are put in, and it is garbage in, garbage out in many cases. Assumptions, biases are blended in. In the case of CPI and inflation data, the model changes over time. Now, I want to move on now and talk about another subject. It's timely, and that is de-dollarization. It's an interesting moment. The BRICS nations are meeting this month in Russia to discuss, among other things, the work that they are doing on a new currency called the unit, which is proposed as an alternative to the United States dollar. Now, we'll come back to this in a second, but the broader question that a lot of people are asking these days is the US dollar coming to an end? Is its dominance in the world coming to its end? Interesting, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, came out with a report earlier this month, which suggests perhaps yes. We'll come on to that in a second. But the question is, are we moving away from the US dollar around the globe? And the answer is yes, but not perhaps as quickly as you might think. So if you look over time, all the way back to 2000, the US dollar represented about 70% of the share of FX reserves around the world. In the past 25 years, that's fallen to some 50, just about 55% on an exchange rate and interest rate adjusted basis. But interestingly, despite the fact that the US dollar share of foreign reserves is going down, meaning that other central banks are holding on to other foreign reserves, whether that be other nations' currencies or gold as part of their foreign reserves, the US dollar has continued to be very, very strong. And it is because most of the debt around the world is denominated in US dollars, which keeps the US dollar in demand. And with that demand, the US dollar is high. Now, since 2006, sort of the low point for the US dollar around that time, in the last 20 years, the relative value is up around 15%. Now, you might say that's good in that consumer prices are lower for US consumers. That's absolutely right. On the other hand, it really hurts US exporters. It hurts US manufacturing. It makes our goods less competitive in the world. And I would argue it hurts the middle and working classes mostly as a result. So de-dollarization, it's clear that it is happening, but perhaps slower than people imagine. Again, we saw this US dollar portion of foreign exchange reserves is going down. At the same time, there's a lot of talk out there around, well, is it going to be replaced by the renminbi, the Chinese yuan? And the answer is apparently not, or at least not yet. The renminbi continues to hold only about a 3% share. You see that on the right here, 3% share of global FX, around the same level. I'm very rounding here with the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar. It's not that significant. It is fair to say that since 2000, non-traditional currencies such as the aforementioned are becoming more and more important. What used to be maybe a 2% share, now reaching above 10% of FX reserves around the world, albeit China is still less than 5%. The takeaway here, though, is that the US and the Western powers, whether that be the Euro, Japan, UK, are each flat or declining in share, the US being the biggest decliner from the highest base. Now, the other interesting thing that we see happening around the world is that central banks, and especially the non-Western central banks, are accumulating gold. So the United States is the biggest holder of gold in terms of its central bank. We have over 8 million tons. Excuse me, 8,000 million tons. Germany 3.3. IMF itself 2.8 metric tons, not million tons, metric tons. 8,000 metric tons also down here. Germany 3.3 thousand metric tons, etc. But the share of gold is growing, especially among the BRICS nations, India, Russia, elsewhere, Poland, Turkey, other nations. And we see that since around that same period, around 2006, when the dollar was weakest, officially, gold holdings in reserve assets are up by some 20%. Now, I say officially with such emphasis because we have reason to believe that China is not fully and fairly disclosing its gold holdings, and they actually have been accumulating a lot more, as other nations may have, and not been repeating it. But we do know that each of China, Turkey, and India each added over 1,000 metric tons in each of 2000 and 2000, excuse me, not 2000, 2022 and 2023. Now, it raises the question of the US dollar dominance. That was the question we started with. And it strikes me, and this is a very interesting chart that I was referred to from silverwars.org that shows over a few thousand years of history how long a particular currency has managed to stay in place. Those of us who are alive have been alive during a dollar-dominated regime around the world. And that has been true for about 100 years now, not quite, but almost 100 years. But you look back before that, the sterling, the French franc, the Dutch guilder, each of these currencies came and went in a matter of 100 or so years. You have to go all the way back to the Venetian ducat in the first, well, in the years AD 500 to 1500. Where the Byzantine Solides and then the ducat really reigned for hundreds of years, almost 1,000 years in the case of the Solides, and the Roman denarius, which lasted as long as the Republican Empire did for around 500 or 600 years before they spent it on wars, depleted their currency through debasement, inflation, and war, as we find ourselves doing now. The other thing that has been interesting to note amidst all of this is the divergence here between those who are doing very, very well in this economy and let's call it Wall Street and Main Street, who is suffering. I wrote about this in an article called The Clash of the Dollar General versus Ferrari Economies. And it is a reflection of the fact that income and wealth inequality just continues to grow. This is facilitated certainly by the easy money policies of the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world. The strong dollar, as I mentioned, actually hurts domestic manufacturing, the domestic economy, and exporters at the benefit of Wall Street, at the benefit of the consumer who can buy cheaper products from China or elsewhere. But what good is it if you can buy cheap Chinese goods if you don't have a job and if you're not making a real wage that allows you to keep up the standard of living? So while Wall Street continues to prosper in the face of inflation, in the face of slowing GDP growth, in the face of corporate layoffs, in the face of a job market that may or may not be there, they're prospering. Wall Street is prospering enormously with stocks at all-time highs, gold, Bitcoin, all sorts of financial assets at all-time high. Main Street is in a practical, if not a technical recession, to be sure, as good-paying jobs grow scarce. The wealth gap, the wealth inequality metric is getting worse and worse. So today, the top 1% of American wealth now hold over 30% of total net worth in the country. The bottom 50%, half of Americans hold only 2.5% of wealth in this nation. This is pretty sad. So we want to keep on. We'll talk about this in a second, what that matters. Now, as I mentioned, Wall Street doesn't seem to care. Markets remain at all-time highs. The old adage, don't fight the Fed. In other words, when the Fed is easing, don't short the market. Go along with the tide. The tide was rising, and it will lift all boats. And when the Fed makes money cheaper, assets inflate and go up in value. I've said this for months now, but I continue to reiterate that the equity markets are overvalued. They will, at some point, cave in. We see the price-earnings ratio is at 36.7 times. That's near an all-time high of 40 times in the year 2000 at the dot-com bubble. We see the Buffett indicator, which is the ratio of the market capitalization of equities to the nation's gross domestic product, is over 200%. going back to the 1920s and the years leading up to the Great Depression, the stock market was in a bubble, but it was only 70% of gross domestic product. And then we had the crash of 1929. Today, the market is valued over double all of the productive income, all the gross domestic product of this country. And yet the market remains optimistic. So I would argue that even still, defensive and inflation hedging assets win so far this year. That's been true. We've seen Bitcoin up 40%, gold up 30%. These have been the better performing asset classes. They've outperformed equities. Looking at the S&P up 20%, and commodities have been pretty flat with oil, at least up to the last couple of days, down pretty meaningfully. The other interesting thing that sort of runs in contrast to my comment on the Dollar General versus Ferrari economies is you look at, we've been in this inflationary period where we've seen food up 20%, energy up 70, 80%, shelter and housing costs up 20% on a 3-year basis, I'm referring to, since coming out of lockdowns. A lot of luxury good categories are actually deflationary. Diamonds down 37.5% since the beginning of 2022. Diamonds are a special class because of the rise of manufactured diamonds that are completely identical, impossible to determine whether a diamond is organic or synthetic these days with the new technology. So there is an anomaly going on there. But even luxury watches, the resale value of Rolexes and other watches, other luxury watches, are down 14% in 2 years. The overall watch market down over 20% during that time. Now, if you're in the top 1%, this is good for you. The things that you care about, that you want to buy, cars, boats, diamonds, watches, are actually cheaper for you. It's the middle class. It's those who spend all of their money on food, all of their money on fuel, all of their money on housing. Those categories have been up double digits, and they're the ones who are suffering. So we see another example of this. Now, I want to come back to this question of the actual wealth of the nation and how we're doing. Now, there's a way to measure this, at least in relative terms, against other countries, and that is called the net international investment position. And simply put, this is saying how much does the U.S. persons, U.S. residents own of the rest of the world in terms of stocks, equity markets, bonds, real estate, whatever it might be, assets. Those are assets to us if we own them. We own a Chinese or Japanese company, that's an asset of ours, against our liabilities. Assets that are stocks, bonds, real estate that foreigners own of our businesses, our real estate, our stocks, our bonds, etc. Now, it turns out through most of the 20th century, the U.S. had a positive net international investment position. In fact, for a long time, it was the highest in the world. Now, that started to end in the 1980s, 1990s, but it was pretty close to zero. It was slightly negative. In fact, all the way through the evil global financial crisis, our net international investment position was negative, but it was a negative 1.2 trillion. That seemed like a lot at the time. And in fact, it was. Trillions are still trillions, no matter how you count them. But within 12 years, by 2019, on the eve of the COVID-19 pandemic, that had grown. That deficit in our net international investment position had grown to nearly $12 trillion. Within just 3 years, 5 years, within just 5 years, that net investment position had grown by another $11 trillion, $10 trillion in just 5 years, of which $6 trillion was lost in the last 2 years alone. You see this graphically here on this page, and done the math over here at the side. So America has now hit an all-time low net international investment position of negative $22.5 trillion. We owe others $58.5 trillion, and we own $36 trillion of their assets. So I wrote this article called America's Dwindling National Wealth. Really is a warning to all of us. This is not getting any better. It's gotten worse in the last 2 years, just as we've talked about in other episodes that the rapid rise in the deficit, the rapid rise in our national debt is sending us on what I've called the deficit debt inflation doom loop. This is another reflection. Our wealth is being diminished. We are growing more and more in debt with U.S. liabilities at an astonishing 58.5 trillion that we owe other nations. Now, you hear a lot in the press about, well, especially around foreign ownership of land in the U.S. as being a big deal. Turns out foreign shareholdings of U.S. farmland or U.S. land overall, is 2.2% of U.S. agricultural, forestry land, etc., in acres. Okay. Now, of that amount, 70% is owned by our neighbors to the north, Canada. We could assume those are relatively friendly hands. And then another big portion by European countries like the Netherlands, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, etc. China, which is often criticized, represents 2.5% of U.S. foreign land ownership, around 500,000 acres. So concerns are probably overblown, although what is legitimate is concerns about the location of some of this Chinese ownership, how they can impact sensitive areas, national security areas, supply chains, etc. So the concern of China's involvement in the U.S. land is correct, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. Now, I want to come back to this issue of the U.S. international investment position. Another way to look at this is our trade balance. The U.S. has been running a trade deficit in goods. I've excluded services here because just to not confound the story, but just in goods, how many goods we import and how many goods we ship elsewhere. The U.S. runs about $1 trillion of trade deficit every year. Now, this hurts U.S. producers and the overall economy. It hurts our balance of payments. It has all sorts of negative, pernicious effects. Now, President Trump, in his first administration, did a lot of work under U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to reduce the trade deficit through strategic tariffs imposed primarily on China. And those have worked. Now, so when he left office, the trade deficit was about $900 billion, but the deficit with China had closed by about 100 billion. So progress was being made. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this, the Biden administration has left a lot of Trump-era tariffs in place. But today we are running a $1.1 trillion trade deficit. And rather than onshore those goods, we've simply shifted our imports from one communist nation, China, to another, Vietnam. So China exports to the U.S. are down by about 100 million, but Vietnam's are up by about 100 million. Neither country particularly close or considered an ally of the U.S., certainly ideologically. Now, earlier last month, former President Trump and presidential candidate Trump detailed at the Economic Club of New York some of his policy proposals. He was focused on the economy and financial matters, given the audience. I was in attendance at the luncheon. I had a chance to hear a lot of this firsthand. One of the most interesting aspects of Trump's policy proposals is the idea of replacing taxes with tariffs. And so there's been a lot of talk since then on, is this realistic? What are the consequences? Would it work? And so I wrote an article, Could Tariffs Replace Your Taxes? Just for a couple other facts, the U.S. imports about 3.1 trillion of goods. That's the $1 trillion deficit that we talked about on the previous screen. And Trump's tariff plan really in the first term actually worked. China now represents only 26% of that goods, that trade deficit in goods in 2023, down from 49%, nearly half of our trade deficit in goods in 2018. But the challenge here is the quantum. The U.S. raises about $4.5 trillion in taxes in revenue, and yet it spends $6.5 trillion. So we've got roughly $2 trillion of deficit spending funded by debt, fueling inflation. But among that $4.5 trillion of taxes, 86% of them are taxes on individuals. So income tax, Social Security, Medicare taxes, and only 2%, roughly 70 billion, comes from tariffs. So this is today a drop in the bucket. But when you think about $1 trillion deficit, 3 trillion of trade, you would have to put tariffs on, call it nearly 100% of all imported goods. That's probably not a wise idea. It's probably not what Trump intended. Nonetheless, a stronger tariff regime could be important, not only for the income benefit, the revenue benefit to the country, but also our strategic interests. It's interesting to note that while Biden abandoned many, if not most, of Trump's policies and really unwound a lot of good that had been done, the one area where the Biden administration largely followed Trump's trade practices, Trump's policies, was on trade. Left in place U.S. tariffs on selected Chinese imports. And in fact, since Trump left office, when tariffs were in the 25% range on certain things like EVs, electric vehicles, semiconductors, solar cells, and 7.5% on a whole wide range of other items, including batteries, medical devices, etc. The Biden administration has actually increased tariffs up to 100% on electric vehicles, 50% on semiconductors and solar cells, medical products, syringes, etc., and raised tariffs from 7.5% to 25% for steel, for batteries, and for personal protective equipment. So there's no doubt that tariffs have a role to play. I think the points to conclude with is that it's not that we necessarily need primarily free trade. We need fair trade. And tariffs are very effective against cheating countries. It's clear that tariffs can help as a coercive measure to bring people back online. And we need balanced trade. We don't have to balance trade with every partner, but on the whole, we need to have balance in our trade. And said differently, we need less import and more domestic production, which is going to take time because we have to redevelop our manufacturing in critical areas like pharma, semiconductors, strategic mineral refining, etc. That's not going to be easy, and that itself may require some subsidizing by the U.S. government. Most importantly, and this is a point that Robert Lighthizer makes and has made for many, many years, is that the U.S. needs to leave the World Trade Organization. China's hand and influence has grown substantially. And really, since 1995, this has been nothing but a net bad for the U.S., net negative, and really an anti-American, anti-U.S. stance. We can't get a fair deal. We can't get a fair trial in the WTO, and we should leave it. And I believe that's probably what Trump intends to do. Speaking of Trump, we're now within 30 days of the presidential election. I've labeled this section of the conversation a most dangerous season, and that has all sorts of implications or meanings. First of all, and what we're not hearing a whole lot of is, the Middle East is entirely on fire. The Israeli conflict continues to escalate. Israel killed the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a Beirut strike. Other leadership were taken out. Israel is making incursions across the border to try to secure some of these areas. Iran has launched some estimates up to 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. Many of them were shot down. Some did manage to get through. This is going ratcheting up the escalation ladder very, very quickly. And it is an incredibly dangerous time, probably more so than I have ever seen in my lifetime, and certainly in this century. And at the same time, our domestic immigration situation is completely out of control. The number of contacts, whether apprehensions, expulsions, have skyrocketed in the last 3 years under Biden administration, as registered by the U.S. Border Patrol. This year alone, we've had 3.2 million encounters, 2.8 last year, 1.9, excuse me, the year before. And another estimate shows that net immigration under Biden has been a total of 10.4 million people. What makes it different than under Bush, Obama, or Trump is the vast majority of these are so-called other foreign nationals. In other words, people who have not crossed the border legally. They've not been part of any lawful program of permanent resident status, or those admitted for work purposes because they add value to a business, to our economy, to our government. No, these are those who cross the border illegally. And we're seeing the impact of this already play itself out in all sorts of ways, oddly and unfortunately, in the fact that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, apparently has run out of money and is unable to help adequately the victims of Hurricane Helene, who are suffering greatly through the Carolinas, through parts of Eastern Tennessee. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas came out a few days ago to say that FEMA does not have the funds to make it through the hurricane season, anticipating there were going to be more. The facts are that FEMA itself on their website right here has indicated that for this fiscal year that we're in right now, or just ended, excuse me, that ended in September, that $641 billion had been provided by FEMA to non-citizen migrant arrivals to enable services associated with housing and resettlement. Okay, $641 billion for non-citizens. And yet, to date, the FEMA says that they're out of money, number one, but number two, they have given a total of $137 million to Hurricane Helene victims. And the boast of this is if $750 per person or per household is going to make any difference. This is a tragedy. This is a betrayal of the American people. It's a betrayal of our values and what we stand for. And additionally, it's theft, it's confiscation of our taxes, of the money that we have paid into the government, believing that our money would be there to take care of us. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are finding out in the most painful way that that is not true. Now, the other aspect of this that makes, and I should just go back and make one more comment. As I sit here and record, we have another major hurricane, Category 5, Milton, I believe it's called, getting ready to move across the state of Florida, likely to be, at least as it's looking right now, more impactful than Helene and more damage potentially. So this is going to crescendo into a real crisis here. How will they resolve it? Well, Congress will be forced to issue emergency funding. In other words, more deficit spending, more money printing. Inflation is here to stay. That you can count on. Finally, just to close it out, I think, as I mentioned, we're within 30 days of the presidential elections. It is a frightening time because we've seen the second attempted assassination of former U.S. President Donald J. Trump, also in what appears to be a relatively amateurish attempt. We don't know anything about either of them yet because we're not getting much information on them. Hard to believe that it wasn't with some coordination in either case. But when one steps back and looks at everything that's happened over the past 8 years or more, the establishment, whatever you'd like to call it, the deep state, the globalists, the people who do not want Trump to come into power, have done everything that they can to keep him out of office, first time and the second time. We had all sorts of disinformation, media propaganda, political propaganda, including incitements to violence over all of these years. You can go back and look at these clips on X or YouTube or wherever, where leader after leader, Democratic Party member or otherwise, media personality, uses language that is absolutely inciting violence. We had years of Russiagate and the whole Russian collusion hoax, all of which has been well documented and proven to be false, but that persisted and our government allowed it to persist because our government was involved in it. The FBI, the CIA, the Department of Justice. We had massive election interference in 2020. There's lots of evidence now. We know this. It's there. We've had state-sponsored lawfare, multiple indictments of President Trump. We've had the Southern District of, that's spelled wrong, Southern District of New York, the conviction on 34 felony counts. He awaits sentencing, which they keep putting off. And then we've had 2 amateur assassination attempts. And don't shoot the messenger here for being, don't blame me for being the one to ask the question, like, what is next? Will Trump even make it to the elections? Will we make it past the elections? Will we even have elections? Will they, whoever they are, devise some way to delay, postpone, cancel, renounce, unwind the results of the election, put the elections off under some pretense? It's a frightening thing to consider. We've never seen it in the US, so it is in that sense unprecedented, an overused word, but in this case one that actually applies. We've never seen an election that was canceled, that was put off in this way. Could it happen? It could happen. And it probably behooves us and a lot of people to spend more time considering the impossible, thinking the unthinkable. What would this mean? What would it mean for the nation? How would we respond? Now, this is the last thing that I want. I wish God's richest blessing on President Trump, and I wish for a full, free, and fair election to occur on November 5th. I'm simply raising the question that I think we can't deny, that this is the most dangerous season that we've seen. It's the most dangerous election we've seen. We spoke 4 years ago about 2020 being the most controversial election ever. Well, this is the most dangerous because of the consequences. And it's hard to imagine an outcome, a good outcome, where that isn't true. So let's pray for President Trump. Let's pray for a successful process to get us to Election Day, that the American people can make their will known, their votes can be cast unhindered, uninterfered with, unaltered, unadulterated, and that we can establish or reestablish some semblance of we the people here in the United States of America. With that, thank you for being with me on Stormwall Advisors Monthly Update, October 2024. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, please do not forget to give it a like, a share, to subscribe, turn on the notification bell. Really helps to know that you're out there and this content is useful. We'll see you next time on the Stormwall Advisors Monthly Update.